Good evening, everyone. I'm Inaiara, the president of Aace Brazil section, and I'm very proud to welcome you here tonight. We are very honored to have Mr. Abba with us for his first talk in Brazil, and we look forward to a fantastic section. So, welcome, Mr. Abba. I will pass the speak to Mr. Guilherme to introduce you. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Well done, Nayara. Well done. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to our webinar with Mr. Wayne Aber on best practices on early development management. Again, we are pleased to have him here with us today. He accepted our invitation in the very first minute. Okay, and we have some ground rules, very simple. Everyone, you are allowed to type on the chat window. And we also have a Q&A button where you can place your questions, okay? So don't let Mr. Abba will speak to us during around 40 minutes, and after that, I will send in the questions. So register your questions as soon as you have them, okay? And don't forget, every time new one come, type your country, your city, so you can see everyone around you, okay? So welcome everyone, good night, and we have wish you, Mr. Abba, a very good speech, okay? The word is yours now.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here virtually from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So welcome everybody. Do I have control here? Need to advance my slides.
Yeah, you have to use the keyboard keys, arrows. Because you are,
got it.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So my agenda is I will first go through a little introduction so you will understand the background that I'm bringing to the presentation this evening. And I'll go over EVM basics very, very briefly because I assume that everybody now has some understanding. And I will discuss how earned value was a key element in transforming project management in the US government, going back to the Clinton-Gore era. And then I'll also touch on what's happening today under the Trump administration. And I'll illustrate that with some case studies, both from the Department of Defense and from the civil agencies of the government. And as we go along, I'll be talking about lessons learned and also lessons unlearned and best practices, and close with a summary and question and answer. So I entered the civil service with the Army in 1967. I held several kinds of positions: production control, I was a computer operator, a procurement specialist, and finally got into project management and earned value management. I left that position in 1982 as the head of the earned value analysis office at the Army Materiel Command and was hired into the office of the Secretary of Defense, where for 17 years, I served as the senior analyst for contract performance management. In other words, earned value management. After I retired in 1999, and I say retired, I've been semi-retired since then. I say I flunked retirement. I took a retirement course before I left the government, but I must have failed it. So I worked with a consultant that supplied software for 5 years. And then I went on my own and I continued to work part-time as an independent consultant. And I've been with these agencies: Social Security, Federal Aviation Administration, the National Nuclear Security Administration. And I do volunteer work for the Government Accountability Office and the National Science Foundation. I'm also on the board of directors of the Graduate School Japan, which is a nonprofit that's organized to help the government. And it goes back to an international performance management council that I created when I was in the Pentagon and I'll come back and talk about that a little bit later on. But in that capacity, I've served as an advisor to the Ministry of Finance, Defense, Economy, Trade, and Industry, which includes the decommissioning of the Fukushima disaster, and the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, or JAXA. Now, my Department of Defense experience includes a lot of programs, and I'll let these scroll on the screen for you. And it's an alphabet soup of abbreviations and short references. And I can tell you that this includes every kind of program that the Department of Defense develops, ranging from, for the Navy, submarines and various kinds of ships, to all kinds of aircraft for the Air Force and for the Navy, and Army systems as well. There are also in here some other programs like LIF Hawk. That's the lead-in fighter Hawk trainer from the Australian government that was procured from a company in the United Kingdom. So I've got experience that goes beyond the Department of Defense and direct hands-on experience with EVM. And through the entire period of time that I worked on these programs, you'll sort of be learning with me as I go through the case studies. When I began working with the Department of Defense and the Pentagon and the Office of the Secretary of Defense, our overruns were in terrible condition. By the time I retired, the total overrun on the 115 largest contracts on $85 billion worth of work was 5.5%. And in the aggregate, they were 60% complete. And that was real data. That was adjusted for over target baselines. So we weren't showing anything that was incorrect here, and no smoke and mirrors. This was real data. That was as of 2001. And I don't believe that that data is collected any longer. U.S. government EVM policy started in 1966 when the Air Force developed the Cost Schedule Performance Control Specification. And that was picked up very quickly by the Department of Defense in 1967 as the Cost Schedule Control Systems criteria for all the departments, Army, Navy, and Air Force. And if you recall, I'm dating myself here, that's the same year that I entered government service with the Army. So you might say that earned value and I grew up together. In 1996, the Office of Management and Budget adopted CSCSC, Cost Schedule Control Systems criteria, in Circular A11. And what that meant was that the defense principles were now being applied across the federal government to the civil agencies as well. In 1997, the Department of Defense changed the name to Earned Value Management System, and that was part of a conscious effort to steer it away from excessive identification with cost and schedule, with cost, I should say, because we were in the DoD Comptroller's office. And OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, followed that same structure in their Circular A11 for government-wide policy. In 2006, federal acquisition regulation clauses were issued to put this on contract for any government contract. In 2011, we took a step backward, in my opinion, when the Department of Defense, now this was after I retired, included the earned value management as part of the business system rules. And the reason I consider that a step backward is because it penalized earned value. It said that if this business systems rules clause says that if you don't comply with the business systems, the government can withhold money. And so earned value was put into that category, which made it a bone of contention between the government and its suppliers, because now they had to report good data. And now in 2025, we're undergoing another wave of regulatory reform. And the good news in that so far is that EVM and integrated baseline reviews have been retained, and I will cover that in a little more detail. The EVM system definition going back to 1967 was to make sure that contractors' internal management systems would provide good data as an adequate basis for responsible decision-making by both government and contractor management and the DoD components, and provide DoD managers with information at a practicable level of summarization. Many, many years later, now in 2025, a recent definition of earned value, now called earned value analysis by our friends in UK, reads much the same. It brings together the cost, scope, and time management of a project to enable proactive management by giving certainty of project status, good metrics to aid project management by allowing visibility of performance and permitting remedial action. And as I was going through my my preparation today, I realized that the slogan on your flag is order and progress. And I think that's entirely in keeping with the objectives of EVM going back more than a half a century. International EVM, I include this slide because as time went by, other governments became interested in what we were doing. For example, the government of Japan sent a delegation from the Ministry of Construction around the world to find best management practices. They visited industry, they visited Microsoft, they visited many countries. And when they came to the United States, I was invited to give them a presentation. And they decided that the DoD, the Department of Defense approach to earned value management was what they wanted to emulate for the Japanese government. And I've been associated with them ever since. The same happened with Australia. They had a blowout on their construction of their Parliament House, and also on a Navy vessel, interestingly named HMAS Success, and they sent a parliamentary a team representing the parliament around the world, again, looking for best management practices. And once again, they decided that what we were doing in the US was the appropriate approach. One thing, though, that I will mention as I learned from Australia was that as they looked at our regulations, they found that much of what we did was based not only on what was written down in regulation, but also on norms and modes of behavior. And so there was some things that did not translate directly into the Australian environment. And so I put together something called an International Performance Management Council so that all of these nations could share information at a more or less official level. And it became very official with Australia and Canada and the United States as we implemented a trilateral memorandum of understanding on contract cost and schedule performance management. So that was an early attempt from my office to try to make sure that what we were doing would be consistent, because now, of course, trade is global, and we wanted to get that understanding among these countries. As I mentioned earlier, I visited Brazil and also had visits from Germany, Israel, Italy, Portugal, and others. Some of you may know my partner, Alexander Rodrigues from Portugal, who does a lot of work with earned value, and as a matter of fact, has been recently doing integrated baseline reviews with Google. These are the basics of earned value management, and I just wanted to put this in here as a level setting device. So the basic idea of earned value is to establish a performance measurement baseline, which is shown here by the green line, representing all of the work that's going to be performed over the life of the contract, planned in detail in the early stages and in less detail in later stages, typically with rolling wave planning as the planning becomes more detailed. It also includes a management reserve, which is a part of the program budget that is set aside for the known unknowns, if you will, the things that we know are going to happen, but we don't know exactly where. And so that is a source of budget when those things happen. As time progresses, we measure our performance using BCWP, budgeted cost for work performed, or earned value. The plan value is BCWS, budgeted cost for work schedules. I put in both of the abbreviations because both are still in use today. When Quentin Fleming wrote the guidance for the Project Management Institute, he thought that the 4-letter abbreviations were too long, so he shortened them to 2-letter abbreviations. Meaning now people have to know both and have to look at what these other things could mean. So when you abbreviate actual cost, AC, it could be alternating current as well. So sorry about the confusion. So earned value is the objective measure of how much of the budgeted value of the work has actually been performed. In this example, we're not performing the full amount, and so we have a unfavorable schedule variance. We can relate that somewhat to the time by just simply striking a line back to the plan for where we should have been at this point, and gives us an approximate time variance. But remember that earned value is not a schedule measurement indicator. It is a resource or a cost measurement indicator. It tells us objectively how we're doing on cost against our budgeted values, but the schedule is not that precise. We'll come back to that in another example. Against that performance, then we track the actual cost of the work that's been performed, and from that we get a cost variance. And in this case, because it shows the relationship among these things, we have an example with an overrun, which would give us an at completion variance. And if we extend the performance that we have to date, we can see that we're going to have a schedule slip. And again, we can't measure that precisely from earned value data, but earned value typically will give you the earliest indication that you're not meeting your schedule because work isn't being performed. And that enables us to begin to quantify the risk at completion. So that's the cumulative trend analysis. And a point that I will reinforce later on is that you should have the entire timeline, because if you isolate the variances and look at, for example, 6 months at a time, you don't get the entire picture of what's going on with the project or the contract. The other essential chart, standard chart, is variance trend analysis, with no variance being perfect performance. Favorable would be up, unfavorable would be south. So in this example, we're showing at time now that much of the management reserve has been consumed, and it tends, of course, towards 0. And at time now, we have a schedule variance here and a cost variance here. Now, the schedule variance, because it's tied to budget values and measuring performance objectively against that, at completion, it must be 0. Now, some people see this as a weakness because you can be ending late and still showing that your schedule variance is improving. That's not a flaw, that's a feature. That is what comes with of measuring earned value in this way. So when people try to adjust for the schedule variance, they're on a fool's errand. The earned value baseline is derived from a schedule. So to manage the schedule, you must do schedule management. You don't do that as part of earned value management. The cost variance, unfortunately, doesn't behave that way. It tends to worsen over time and end up with a cost variance at completion that's an overrun. And you will see real-life examples of these through case studies. And I have a couple of them for you from defense. And the first one is the Navy's A-12 Avenger II. This was the Navy's first attempt to build a stealth attack bomber. We didn't know this program existed in the Pentagon because it was so highly classified. But at some point, because the Soviet Union was collapsing, the management wanted us to take a look at how this program was performing. And so we had an analyst who was granted access to the program at a high security clearance, went down and looked at it and came back and said, we have a disaster on our hands. And an analysis that we did in the office led to a termination for default on that contract. That in turn led to 18 years of litigation as the contractor sued for relief from the termination for default. This was McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics. And the default was eventually upheld in December of 2008, and I'll show you how we got there. The reason that earned value didn't work on this project was it was regarded as a reporting requirement. However, earned value analysis was introduced as evidence in the 5th trial in 2001. You can see that it was terminated for default in 1991, and it stayed in litigation for a long time, for 18 years. It took until 2001 before the earned value analysis was introduced. And it was introduced by an expert witness, and that expert witness was myself. And I look at this as an example of forensic project management where we're analyzing the body after the failure. These are the charts that were actually produced and from which I derived the expert testimony. So it's General Dynamics and McDonnell Douglas Aircraft. The contract was for full-scale engineering development. It was fixed price incentive, which meant that the government and the contractor would share in an overrun up to some ceiling price. The data were as of December 31st, 1989. We see here the budgeted value and the contractor's estimate of cost at completion just above that. And we see the project managers, the government project managers' estimate of completion considerably above that. The value of the contract is around $4 billion US, and the PM's estimate at completion is already up to $4.8 billion. Now, as you look at that, does anything jump out at you? I'll point out a couple of things to help you here. First of all, look where the reporting began. Many months had transpired from the beginning of the contract before any data were available. And the data at that point were unity. The planned value, the earned value, and the actual cost were the same. And then variances began to accrue, which don't show up very much because it's a $4 billion scale. But I would invite you to take the budgeted cost for work scheduled line, the BCWS, and in your mind's eye, project that out to where it has to be at completion. Can you get there from here without going flat for many years? Which would imply that there was no plan. This is an extreme example of a front-loaded plan where the budget is distributed to the front of the contract. So these variances, however bad they might be, are going to be severely understated. So let's see what happens if we project out the estimates of cost at completion. There's the contractor, and there's the project manager. Now, without having advanced mathematical techniques, in my office, when I drew charts like this, I used a French curve, which turns out to work out very well indeed. And if I didn't do it for this example, but if I were to put in here the number of articles that were being built in this full-scale engineering development contract, you would have seen aircraft deliveries all through this period with no budget for them. And it really becomes clear if you take an independent look at the estimated cost at completion, as I did, and it goes completely off the chart. So against a target of about $4 billion with a ceiling of 4.8, I came up with an estimate of cost at completion that ranged anywhere from 9 to $14 billion. So here's what the variances look like. If the variances were 10%, they would be within this little cone. But look where they are. The schedule variance is early, large, and unfavorable. Work is not getting done. The contractor is failing to perform, and what little work is getting done is overrunning significantly. But if you take the contractor's data and project it to the estimate at completion, it's going to have to improve over time. And the project manager's estimate says it's going to level off. What this means is that the contractor is probably going to have to send checks back to the government because that work is being done not only for free, but for less than that in order to improve that cost variance. And the project manager says it'll be done for free. I think in looking at this data, this is an extreme example. Imagine that you're in the office of the Secretary of Defense. You are the Secretary of Defense. And the situation you're in is that the Berlin Wall has fallen, the Soviet Union has collapsed. What do you do with a project like this? Well, the Secretary of Defense canceled it. This became a bill payer. Now, to be fair, the contractor probably wasn't interested in making money on that development contract. I don't think they understood how bad it was going to be, but what they wanted was the $52 billion production contracts that were to follow. And that's not extraordinary, but the amount of the loss is extraordinary. I think it would have bankrupted the contractors had that contract been allowed to go to completion. Mr. Cheney said, program can't be sustained unless I go back to Congress and ask for money and bail the contractors out, but I won't do that. No one can tell me exactly how much more it will cost to keep the program going. Well, I beg to differ. Had they been looking at the earned value information, they would have had a very good clue, but they weren't because they knew that it wasn't measuring reality. And from this, we take a lesson. Failure or crisis changes behavior in bureaucracies. And this was the largest termination case in history. We had overpaid the contractor somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.7 billion in overpayment and accrued interest. That prompted a inquiry, a high-level inquiry called the Beach Report, named for the lawyer who led the inquiry. My boss in the Pentagon at the time was on this review team, and he helped to develop these lessons that were learned. That we had an abiding cultural problem. We had existing controls. Had they been properly applied, would have been sufficient to tell us what was going on. But too often, earned value belonged to the program control staff, both on the contractors and the government side. And it has to be an integral part of the way business is being done. It's got to be made the responsibility of the project managers and the engineers who are doing the work. Only when you hold program technical staffs accountable will they understand the implications. Well, the Navy faced a crisis because their aircraft were becoming obsolete. They were going to have empty carrier decks. And so they developed the FA-18EF Super Hornet, the Phoenix, if you will, out of the ashes of the A-12. And they awarded contracts to McDonnell Douglas, which is now Boeing. But McDonnell Douglas was the same contractor as on the A-12. Well, the admirals made a visit to McDonnell Douglas, and they said, you build a fine airplane, but you got to get your management act together. And if you don't, you won't get another contract. And all of this spurred the DoD's EVM initiative to do things better. My second case study is the Super Hornet. And as the Navy was working with the contractor to plan for the management of this, I was talking to the people who were doing the earned value review for the Navy. And this came out to be a very, very different approach. For example, in most contracts, all contracts up to that point, earned value was a monthly reporting process. But at McDonnell Douglas, they decided that didn't give them enough insight because they were statusing their schedules every week, but they were only statusing earned value every month. and they were getting the information on that 2 weeks later. So by the time they looked at the earned value information, it was already 6 weeks out of date. So they set the earned value tempo to the same tempo as their team meetings, integrated with the schedule status. And the earned value measure that they used for this was not dollars spent, but it was labor hours planned and earned. So they were using the actual currency of the project, if you will, to get progress measurement. This was an extraordinary example of government industry cooperation. And I would submit to you that it was EVM as it should be, coordinated with the business tempo and reporting as the byproduct. My hope was that this would be a foundation for change. Here's the FA18EF contract performance. And I would point out that reporting began on day 1. Even though the estimate for the EF was based on the prior FA18 A, B, C, D models, the cost estimate from the government going in was much higher than what was awarded. This was a $3.4 billion contract. And when they definitized the contract, which happened not too long after the contract start, this became the performance measurement baseline and never deviated over the life of the contract. Against that, there were no variances to speak of. They had extraordinary scope control, effective planning, EVM used effectively, and excellent performance. You see something that happened here. The PM's estimate went up for a period of time and then dropped. During that period of time, they were dealing with a phenomenon called wing drop. During the flight testing, they would get to a certain G-force and the wing would lose a lift. And they had to make some corrections to deal with that. When they corrected that, they realized it wasn't going to be a huge cost, and they had an increase in scope at the same time. And what happened was they were able to apply the management reserve to put in some things that they had deferred, adding to the baseline. So this is, again, an example of paying attention to what's going on, controlling the scope, not letting it get out of control, and delivering an aircraft with, again, no variances. So here's a 10% cost and schedule variance band. Here's the management reserve as it was brought down, and the cost and schedule variance was never remarkable. Well, what did that good management cost? According to the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, when he talked about the smoothness of the acquisition program, he said, "I wake up every morning and I want to kiss the Super Hornet on the lips." What made it so lovable? It's efficient, effective platform, under cost, and on schedule. Unfortunately, those lessons went unlearned. Now, I retired in 1999. My boss retired in 2000. And the emphasis declined. And when that happened, we saw problems begin to arise in several programs: Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, Littoral Combat Ship, the Joint Strike Fighter. And the earned value process reverted to reporting system. The government oversight was relaxed. And the idea there was that the contractors would take responsibility. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen. It reminds me of the Reagan slogan, "Trust but verify." And earned value was misapplied, and there was criticism by the Naval Audit Service and the Government Accountability Office. And let me talk for a moment about the GAO, because at the same time all this was going on, I was working with the GAO to take the things that had happened in the government and incorporate them, in my experience in the government, and incorporate them into GAO cost guide. The GAO started this process of creating best practice guides, and the cost estimating and assessment guide was the first one. It was 3 years in development, and it was updated most recently in March of 2020. It's quite comprehensive. It has 20 chapters covering cost estimating, risk management, and so on. 16 of the chapters are dedicated to those disciplines, and 4 are dedicated to earned value management. In Appendix 3, they have a list of names of significant contributors to the cost guide. And I, again, tell you that I was one of those experts because I don't want to tell you anything that's hearsay. I was involved in all of these meetings. And as a matter of fact, I introduced the GAO to so many experts from around the world. We had people from foreign nations participating in this, that they were confident enough that they had best practices, that they didn't have to go out for a comment stage when they published the guide. The GAO is important in this discussion because they're not part of the executive branch. They're the independent investigative arm of the Congress. And they changed their name from the General Accounting Office to the Government Accountability Office. Financial audits were about 15% of their workload. But under the Government Accountability Office, they emphasize more their program evaluations and policy analyses, being an advocacy for truth and transparency, and looking not just for what is wrong, which is what auditors are often criticized for, but for the best practices. So this cost guide was intended for their use as auditors, but also as a resource for agencies that lack the capabilities of the major agencies, the smaller agencies. I was most recently at a GAO expert meeting last month, and I was assured that the GAO best practices aren't going anywhere, which was very refreshing to hear in this time of regulatory reform. Also around the same time, after I had retired from the Department of Defense in 1999, I went to work as a consultant with the Federal Aviation Administration. In 2004, they had a substantial budget reduction. And they were on the GAO's high risk list. So they were known as not performing very well. They began in 2005 a major transformation to improve the way they were doing their project management. And that was comprehensive: policy guidance, training, program assessments. And they did EVM at the program level, not only their contractors, but also their government employees. We set up interdisciplinary work teams, including systems engineering, risk management, cost estimating, contracting, finance, and operations, and created an earned value management council to oversee that. This is what their projects looked like when we went in and did an evaluation. The programs are on this left axis, 26 of them, and the earned value guidelines, 32 guidelines, are across the horizontal. And so we did a typical stoplight assessment. We used an X if the particular criterion didn't apply. And for these things that are marked in blue, they were across the agency. The individual projects weren't responsible for them. So we took a project by project approach. We wanted to make sure that if something didn't apply to a project, we would highlight that and not worry about it. And also the ones that are in black were ones that were too far along in performance to be concerned about. So that was our baseline in 2005. In 2008, this was our result. Measured by the same people using the same criteria. And so it was not, again, smoke and mirrors. This was real improvement. In January of 2009, after 14 years, the GAO took the air traffic modernization off the high risk list, recognizing the significant progress, the fewer overruns and scheduled delays, and emphasizing that going forward, they need to place a high emphasis on effective and efficient management. It was the only program across the government that was removed from the list, and EVM played a very significant role. Turning to the National Science Foundation, I had a conversation with a man who was working there about their policy. they had a policy that said that they would not overrun. Now imagine that. All you have to do to avoid overruns is tell people not to have them. How effective do you think that would be? At the same time, they had a policy that said they were not allowed to have contingencies in their cost estimates. And that was being decreed by the people who were auditing their programs. Well, the natural result of that was that people were hiding their contingencies in their cost estimates where they were easily found by the auditors, setting up a lot of conflict. But I met with the NSF leadership and pointed out that this was a self-inflicted wound because the auditors were in fact wrong, that contingencies are a best practice as identified by the Government Accountability Office. And I was able to facilitate a presentation by the GAO team leader about the best practice guides that were developed or in development for the National Science Foundation. As a result, the NSF revised their policy to establish appropriate contingencies. And if you think about a National Science Foundation project, it may not sound really complicated at first, but consider this. An observatory might be built on top of a volcano in Hawaii, so they don't know what the ground conditions are. Everything has to be built someplace else in the world by many, many educational institutions and countries and transported to Hawaii and erected on this mountaintop. So contingency is clearly needed for a project that has that kind of risk. So the NSF sort of invited me to put up or shut up, put my money where my mouth was. And they invited me to participate on their peer review panels and work with their projects on ongoing reviews. So the first one was the Advanced Technology Solar Telescope. It's now the Daniel K. Inouye Solar Telescope in Hawaii. This is a large telescope that is designed to collect images of the sun and bring space weather forecasting, solar forecasting into the same, to advance it from the 1950s era, which is where it was basically. And as I went to the review, the first review on that project, it occurred to me that that telescope was going to be gathering a tremendous amount of heat, but I was too embarrassed about my lack of technical knowledge to ask a question about it. However, later on, somebody told me at a conference that my work with contingency at the leadership level had saved the program, because in fact they had a large contingency for that unknown, and they did have cooling problems when they went to activate the telescope, and they had the contingency reserve to be able to take care of that. I went on to work with the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, which detected gravitational waves as predicted by Einstein 100 years ago. And the technology on this observatory, which is laser-based, I was told was tantamount to detecting a change in the orbit of Saturn to the width of a single human hair. I said, you can't do that. And they said, yes, we can. And they did. And they won a Nobel Prize for that. For all the years that this project has been going on, I've been involved with the ATLAS and CMS experiments at the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland. That scope is shared with the Department of Energy. And that most recent review was just a few weeks ago. And that project is going along quite well as well. The Giant Magellan Telescope and the 30-meter telescope are two others in development that have benefited from this change. Now, the National Science Foundation went to the GAO best practice guides as a foundation for their policies. And I can tell you that from direct interface with the GAO that they very much admire the National Science Foundation's approach. The EVM was incorporated in the planning and review process in the research infrastructure guide, striking a balance between assistance and oversight. So earned value here is being used as a mechanism to help projects succeed. And the way the policy is written is if you're a very large project, you must use earned value management according to the Federal Acquisition Regulation and the Office of Management and Budget. If you're a mid-scale project, then the National Science Foundation invites the project to explain to them how the project will be managed if it's not using EVM. Very sensible approach. So lessons that I've learned from all of this is that EVM works. It works when it's done properly. And when it's not done properly, it works because it tells you that you don't know what you're doing. You don't have a good plan. You don't have a method to measure your progress effectively. And I can tell you a little story about that. When I was working with industry, we went out 44 times. I went out personally 44 times in 1 year to talk to industry leaders without the government being present. And the purpose of those meetings was to show them what their data looked like as we analyzed it in the Pentagon. We had less data than anybody else did because we were looking at quarterly information at level 1, and yet nothing big escaped us. And when I went to Boeing, I was told after my presentation by a senior vice president that I saw more on 2 charts than they saw on 7 that they used in their regular reviews. He said, I want those charts. The irony is that his people had been trying to get him to see those charts for years, but they couldn't get it through their own bureaucracy. Later, I bumped into their chief executive officer in the Pentagon. He was in for a meeting, and he told me that had he known I was going to be there, he would have brought in his Abba charts, but they had begun to use them for their commercial business. And they found when they did that they were lacking in information that was necessary for them to understand project performance contributing to revenue. EVM reveals problems that should have been resolved earlier. Scope, WBS underestimating, schedule optimism, front loading, buy-ins, or as some contractors claim, auctions by the government. You want to discover these issues as early as you possibly can so that you can manage with the lights on. And so EVM is best seen as an integrated management tool or process versus an audit or reporting process. One of the lessons is to avoid perverse incentives. When people found out that no variances are good, they begin to write contracts incentivizing contractors to not have any variances. Well, I call that green syndrome. And that's perverse because it encourages contractors to game the system, to play with the budgets and play with the schedules so that they can earn the incentives. Excessive requirements are always a problem when you're dealing with the bureaucracy. And I want to illustrate that a little bit with a simple example. Which of these numbers is a better number? Kind of depends on where you sit. If you're a contractor, or if you're the program manager, if you're at agency level or in the office of Secretary of Defense, as I was, A is good enough. If you're an analyst or an auditor, you're going to push for perfection. You want to get down to the precise number, but that's the enemy of good enough. Excessive data is costly in terms of time, money, and management acceptance. It does, of course, have to be timely, reliable, and actionable and used for management. And the story I can tell you about that one involves the SSN-21 nuclear attack submarine. It was meant to be a program of 29 boats, as I recall. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, it got truncated down to 3. When we started doing the earned value planning for it, the project manager attended every earned value meeting. His name was Captain Shipway, perfectly named shipbuilding commander. He had been a project manager and a skipper on the SSN 688 class. And he told me that he wanted to drive the work breakdown structure down to the rivet level, not literally, but very, very low. And I asked why, because it was going to cost him a lot of money to do that. He said, this is going to be a big class of ships. It's going to cost more money than we've ever spent. And I want to make sure that I know what's driving the cost so I can use that information to drive the cost out. And later on, we can adjust the work breakdown structure accordingly. I said, brilliant. And that's what he did. But then when the program got truncated down to 3 boats and he no longer needed all of that detailed information, he invited me to go up to Electric Boat in Connecticut with him. We met with the contractor and we pulled the WBS back up to a level that wasn't driving cost in that fashion. So you have to figure out what reliable means. Well, in my example, you don't need to stop the train and count the ties in order to figure out how far you've gone. But the way that you do that in advance is by agreeing on the management plan and performance measurement, and we use something called an integrated baseline review for that. Now, the integrated baseline review came about because sitting in the Pentagon, my boss and I said, you know, we don't have enough involvement by the technical people, and that's a big problem with earned value. So how can we make that happen? So we thought that we would mandate a technical baseline review, and we called it that, a TBR. And we put it into place for an Army Program Executive Office. And we knew the EVM office there, we knew the people, so we just said, do it. And they went out and created the first one, and it was brilliant. It worked wonderfully. Industry said that it was the smartest thing that we ever did. And the idea was to just get people together. I'll come back to that in a moment as we discuss best practices. Best practices are to fit the EVM to the project. You don't want to force the project to comply with a system. When you think of earned value as a system and projects operating within it, that's a different mindset than working with the project team to establish effective project controls as they do at the National Science Foundation. Another best practice is to remember that you're not looking to fix the blame, you're looking to fix problems. And so this goes to the heart of teamwork. In order to pull that off, you need strong leadership support. One of the project managers from the industry told me that you can't take a day off. He said, when things are going well, you're tempted to not pay attention. He said, but you have to pay attention. You have to constantly work with the team. Another best practice is to baseline to early start dates. If you don't start early, it's going to give you a negative variance. Well, that sounds bad, but it's good because it gives you the earliest possible warning. When General Electric aircraft engines set up their earned value system, they found it was easy to parse variances that were meaningful against variances that were not meaningful. So they were able to deal with that problem of false variances very easily. And of course, do integrated baseline reviews. Here's a chart from the Government Accountability Office Best Practice Guide. And I include it here because it shows the systems engineering, cost analysis, earned value, and program management disciplines and how the flow of a program goes against that. So you have concept definition coming from an operational or functional concept. In the Department of Defense, it means you identify a threat and you come up with a solution, you analyze the alternatives, come up with a work breakdown structure, life cycle cost estimate, do risk analysis, requirements definition, and from that, you get an acquisition plan. From that acquisition plan, you develop an acquisition cost estimate, your work breakdown structure gets refined, risk analysis gets refined, and it leads into the earned value performance measurement baseline. And I won't belabor this because we've talked about this before, but so many times when you're actually doing earned value management and doing an integrated baseline review, the problems you're uncovering should have been discovered upstream from where you are today. They incorporate to get a little bit more granularity in earned value and risk management, they have this slide, which in turn was developed from one that we developed in the National Defense Industrial Association. After I retired, I became a member of the NDIA and I helped develop this one. So this one shows the relationship between risk management and earned value management, resulting in integrated guidance. And I won't belabor that, but the two techniques are interactive until you finally get to the end of the contract where you're incorporating risk managements into the, or at the end of the planning where you're incorporating risk impacts into the estimate of completion. Where we sit today in the Office of Management and Budget, as we've gone through acquisition reform, the current version of acquisition reform, I would point out to you that we had acquisition reform under Clinton Gore many years ago, a couple of decades ago, but it was done quite differently. It was done in collaboration with industry, and the Deputy Secretary of Defense got together with industry and hosted a dinner that became known as the Last Supper. He said that change is coming. We're going to be downsizing our government projects, our defense projects. And that means that you're going to have to downsize the industrial base. And we would rather you do that to yourselves than we do it to you. And the result of that was a consolidation of the industrial base from 26 contractors down to the big four. But in all of that, there was not a single lawsuit that challenged the legitimacy of those changes that were being made in the department. Today, lawsuits are happening everywhere. But that said, as people looked at what's happening in government today and came up with the draft policy in the Office of Management and Budget, Office of Federal Procurement Policy, we have this. And I can tell you that this is very current information because I checked with the Office of Federal Procurement Policy before, just an hour before making this presentation. And I found these policy documents are right now current. So the policy is to have an earned value management system in accordance with the Office of Management and Budget Circular, and for major acquisitions and for other acquisitions as desired in accordance with agency procedures. And it has to be compliant with EIA 748. As a minimum, the government will get monthly reports. And when you do earned value management, you also do an integrated baseline review. And this talks about the purpose of an IBR to verify the content and realism of budgets, resources, and schedules, and provide for mutual understanding. This is very important. You need to get all of the people together, and you know, going back to the charts about the acquisition plan and the requirements, you want to have people who are going to be operating the systems who are participating in these IBRs as well. You want it to be very, very inclusive. If you're going to err on the side of inclusivity rather than exclusivity. So when you're done, you've got a joint assessment by the offerer, the contractor, and the government of the technical plan to achieve the objectives of the scope, the adequacy of the time, the ability of the performance measurement baseline to successfully execute the project and measure performance. The newest guide that's out has not from the United States government, it's from the Association for Project Management in UK. The lead author is a man named Paul Kidston, and Paul was one of those people I alluded to earlier who was involved internationally. As a matter of fact, I took Paul to Japan to work with the Japanese when we had a conference over there. This guide is very comprehensive. It's 42 chapters and it's hundreds of pages. but they have prepared this as a how-to guide across many disciplines. You don't get to the IBR until chapter 29 in earned value analysis or earned value management, chapter 31, in performance measurement in chapter 32. And the distinguishing thing between these two is if you're not doing earned value, then what are you doing? And in many cases, that turns out to be a simplified form of earned value management. One of my colleagues at the National Science Foundation told me they weren't doing earned value on a project that was to build and to put sensors around the world. I don't even know if they were water sensors, sea sensors, air sensors, what they were, but there were small devices that were going to be deployed worldwide. And he said, we're not doing earned value on the development of these things. They're small, they're simple. He said, what we're doing is we're counting how many we're deploying against the schedule. And I said, well, what you're doing is earned value at its very fundamental definition. You're measuring the performance of the thing that's being delivered relative to its plan. And I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that that is earned value. This guide I have shared with the Government Accountability Office. The GAO is preparing a guide on project and program management, and I've suggested to them that this would be a good example for them to use. And they've agreed, and the man who's leading that guide said that he will sleep with this under his pillow. Here are some resources that are available to you then. Links, hot links to the GAO guides, the Association for Project Management. You can buy the book through that link. And the National Science Foundation policies. And finally, an article that I wrote fairly recently that puts in article form many of the kinds of things that we've been talking about. Before I close, I want to recognize, you know, some people that I've worked with over the years, like the people on government and industry side who make things work. One of them is Pat Finneran, who I know has expressed interest in this particular forum. I met him as a Boeing executive, and Pat is one of the people who made things work very, very well in the division that he was responsible for. Another is Admiral Joe Dyer, who was a project manager on the F/A-18EF Super Hornet. And Joe understood all of the things that we were trying to do, and he made them happen in his environment. You know, sometimes project managers don't like things like earned value. They're a pain to them, a specialty they don't care to get involved with. I had one Army project manager come into my office in the Pentagon and say that I had come up with an estimate of completion that was higher than his. He said, you're telling me I'm a bad project manager. I said, no, sir, I'm not telling you that at all. What I'm telling you is that if your estimate of completion comes to be the actual fact, you're making history, because nobody has ever seen performance improve to that extent. And we have that backed up by research that was done at the Air Force Institute of Technology on our contract database. He went back and he confronted his contractor, and when they committed truth, he recommended that his project be canceled, and he was rewarded for that and actually promoted into another job. So these are examples of the kinds of things that we can do. With that, I've come to the end of my slides, and I think I've probably run a little overtime from what we anticipated, but I'm available to answer your questions as long as you like.
Outstanding, outstanding, Mr. Abba. Outstanding. And we have so far we have six questions, and then they are very, very interesting questions. And if you like, Mr. Wayne, you can close your presentation mode, okay? And
Okay.
and bring your Q&A button, okay? And you can read together with me the questions.
Gotcha.
Were you able? Were you able to open the Q&A window?
I'm there.
Okay. So the first one we have from André Cavalcante. How do you approach measuring progress in working packages of intangible nature, like engineering, design, and things like this?
Great question. Now, one of the ways to do that is if you're producing drawings, to make the drawings your measurement basis. Just as the sensor thing I was talking about, you're looking for objective measures of progress to the extent that you can find them. So if you're actually producing drawings, then they have to be prepared by a milestone date to support the next evolution in the project, such as a preliminary design review, a critical design review, and so forth. You can apply earned value to that. If it's more nebulous than that, there's a technique in earned value called level of effort. Level of effort is not directly measurable, and it relies on judgment. And the problem with level of effort is that it tends to get up to 95% and stay there for a long time. But still, it's even though it's not as objective as other forms of measurement, it's something that you have to accommodate. And this is what you do in the integrated baseline review. When you sit down and discuss the planning, you know what you can objectively measure, and you discuss how you're going to measure these other things. Sometimes you take things off the earned value process and measure them outside. For example, at the National Science Foundation, a lot of labor is free because they use universities. So it's student labor. It's labor that is involved in educational activities. That is a little bit more difficult to measure objectively than things that are measured by payroll or labor hours.
Okay. Sometimes you can use also measured milestones. Weighted milestones can be also, in some special situations, a good workaround.
Very good. Exactly. Thank you.
Okay, just completing because, but another one from Jonas. What is the before guys? I presented on the chat a link to the LinkedIn. Okay, I made a publication, a post on LinkedIn about our webinar here, some pictures, and I ask you kindly to get there on LinkedIn, make comments, and help us spread the word. Okay, thank you for helping to enter comments on LinkedIn. Okay, got it. Back to the questions. What is the accuracy of EVM at the start and end of contracts? And can the actions taken at the beginning based on EVM be affected by natural variations caused by low initial mobilizations of resourcing projects?
Well, I'll take the second one first because the low initial mobilization is built into the plan. So you ought to get objective measurement against your mobilization, whatever it is. So that should not really be a factor. As to the accuracy, that depends, on the nature of the project. If you're doing something that's been done before, the accuracy is going to be more reliable, if you will. If you're doing something that's never been done before, that is indeed the reason why earned value was invented in the first place, to begin to find a way to get a handle on these things that are difficult to measure. So there's a continuum there, and you do the best you can with what you've got. And the accuracy, when you distribute your budget, you want to show the distribution over time and see if it's realistic. If you don't have something that looks like an S-curve, then you may have a problem. That's again the phenomenon of front loading, where you're applying too much budget to the front end relative to the back end of the project. I can give you a story on that one involving the V-22 Osprey, the vertical lift helicopter that turns into an airplane by tilting its rotor. And the project had some significant failures, some really terrible failures. But by the time that got it into its third iteration of development, they already had the tooling, they already had much of the work done that would lead it into the production phase. And so the baseline looked like that A12. It was very steep initially. And when I went to the integrated baseline review on it, unbeknownst to me, a Navy man had told the project manager, who was a Marine colonel, that he was going to be in trouble because I was going to say it was like the A12. And when I sat down with the colonel and he explained the situation to me, I said, well, that makes perfect sense to me. So we'll see how it works in performance. And when the reports came into the Pentagon, I was able to explain that to the senior leadership. As it turned out, the project executed the way he said it would, and he and I became best friends.
Oh, good, very good, very interesting. Good stories too. And from Zalder, it is very common for us to carry out construction work alongside engineering design. This means that we need to reschedule and rebudget projects every 3 months, whether due to the change the quantities to be executed changes in scope or other factors. As a result, we have a new baseline every quarter, making it difficult to see indexes such as SPI, CPI, so on, since they remain equal to 1 when the baseline is updated. What do you recommend in cases like this?
Oh boy. I recommend that you don't change it so much. But that's difficult. You know, there's an agile guide in the GAO, and I would recommend that you go look at that and see. You can coordinate EVM with agile management, but there may be a point where it becomes meaningless. And one of the ways that I approach this kind of a question is to ask, does resource consumption matter to you? Does the cost at completion of the contract, the project, matter to you? If it doesn't, don't try to do this stuff like you would if it were a different situation. Baselining every quarter sounds to me like an extreme. That sounds like it's a bit too much. Because
Okay.
the situation that he describes is accurate. It's very difficult to use indices to project performance in that circumstance.
Yes, a yoke pour on every 3 months, day of the pardon. And now from
On that note, Guilherme,
Yeah.
Mr. Abba, you perhaps can keep your baseline, your original baseline, to make your comparisons, and even with the revised baselines, you follow your execution strategy, but you
Yes.
base your KPIs on your original baseline.
You can do that. And the difficulty with that is that the data become meaningless against the original baseline at some point. And there's a technique called an over-target baseline that you can use as well. And I didn't get into that level of sophistication on this presentation, but the GAO guide talks about over-target baselines. And so you can measure performance against the work that you're actually doing with an over-target baseline, but it's always with reference back to what the original baseline was. And the reason that we did that was because when you lose track of that initial baseline and you're in a long-term project like you are in the Department of Defense, you have new leadership coming in, and they don't realize what the initial promise was. And with one of the programs that I dealt with, the Secretary of the Army, an assistant secretary, said, I didn't know that, we made that initial promise. He said, if I had known that this project is too expensive, we would not have proceeded with it. So it's that idea of managing with the lights on and knowing what all of the circumstances are.
Right.
Okay. Very
Thank
good.
you.
Very good. And another one from Rodrigo Gandra. Hello, Rodrigo. Hello, I'm Rodrigo Granda. I worked on the Brazilian Navy's Tamandaré Class Flight 8 project. It was the first defense project to require EVMs as a contractual requirement, and this practice is being applied to other Navy defense projects. However, the contract was a lump sum, which generated considerable debate between the parties, as the contractor obviously didn't want to disclose the actual cost. In the end, they accepted. What do you think of EVM in fixed price contracts?
Well, he who has the gold makes the rules. So that's the resolution that you got on this one. But this has been a problem all around the world because this was the acquisition technique in Australia. It's the acquisition technique in Japan. And so one of the things you do is try to look for a surrogate. Labor hours is a good one. On a contract like shipbuilding, material consumption and labor hours are ways to get earned value without actually exposing the direct costs that are being incurred. So that's a bit of a compromise. But you know, it goes back to that thing I said earlier. If resource consumption doesn't matter to you, then you don't worry about it. But if you're awarding lump sum fixed price contracts, you've got a bit of a dichotomy there because in my opinion, the contractor has a valid argument that you're giving them the authority to do this work. At the same time, you have a valid argument as a customer that you have to support the fleet. You have requirements to meet. You have launch dates to meet. You have all of those things to consider. So it sounds like it was a sophisticated approach to actually resolve the problem.
Okay, but they can also, after that, incur in claims. Actually, we accepted too many risks, so perhaps we'd like to claim these, claim that, and so on. That can be a problem on lump sum contracts.
Well, you know, in the U.S. Navy, one of the big problems that I went after was the shipbuilding overrun problem. And when we brought the parties together, the contractors said the Navy is auctioning off their ships. They're awarding to the lowest bidder. And the Navy said the contractors are buying in. And both were correct. So the acquisition strategy was to bid them low and make them grow. And when you do that, you end up with these monumental overruns that aren't foreseen, and you're not solving anybody's problem. So it need to have more equity in those kinds of situations.
And to negotiate conflicts like this demands almost a masterpiece in tools.
If I take a purely EVM point of view on that, EVM again will tell you those problems. They will discover them very quickly when you see that work is not being performed.
Well, absolutely. Another from Jonas. How do you deal with long-range projects applying EVM in a rolling wave planning scenario?
Yeah. What you do in a rolling wave planning scenario is you determine what your rolling wave is, say it's 6 months, and then how you are going to lay out the next 6-month increment or whatever it might be. But the best practice, of course, is to do like a mini IBR before you get to your next planning wave initiation. So you're going to be pulling budget down from what we call planning accounts, from higher level planning accounts, to put them into the control accounts. So it's not an exotic process. It's very standard in the EVM world that you do your detailed planning as far in advance as is practicable. That means that you push your engineers to do more planning than they want to do. and you get into that give and take conversation.
Okay. And we have a question from Dan Melland. And can you discuss in some detail how one would right-size the 32 EVM guidelines to specific projects?
You know, that's one of my failures in life is I wanted to make counting guidelines go away. And I failed at that. When I started in this business, there were 35 guidelines and there were 150 questions, and bureaucrats are fond of counting things. That's what they do the best. But they're not the people who are responsible for implementing these contracts. The simple answer to the question is you go through the guidelines and see whether it applies to the project. And that's exactly how it's done at the National Science Foundation. They don't worry about tailoring the guidelines per se.
And we have another one in the chat. In his project examples, the contractors' outer costs were completely controlled by the government. Again, repeating, okay. In his project examples, the contractors' actual costs were completely controlled by the government. These questions is in the chat window.
Oh, in the chat. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? I was looking for it.
Okay. In his project examples, the contractor's actual costs were completely controlled by the government, by the owner. In the examples you provided.
The contractor's estimates were controlled by the government?
The actual costs.
Actual costs.
Yeah.
All the data that I showed you were come directly from the contractor's books.
Okay, Joe.
Except for the project manager's estimate of completion. That was government.
Okay. And
There
we
is
have
a question in Portuguese, by Aace, and he's asking regarding change management, control, and management of trends and cost and schedule contingencies. What is, in your view, the main difficulty in change management and impact management throughout the project? Would it be related to controlling known risks or those that are unknown and unexpected?
Oh boy. That is really a tough question. That's an all-encompassing question. Let's level set on terminology first, because they're actually reversed within the US government. I presented management reserve as being part of the contract budget that's applied to what you call the known unknowns. The contingencies are outside of the contract. In the Department of Energy, it's reversed. The contingency is within the budget, and management reserve is outside. So you have to be clear what you're talking about when you talk about these things. So if you're developing a system, an aviation system, for example, and you find that it doesn't do what you need to do, you need to build in a new capability for a threat that you hadn't anticipated, then that is something that's outside of the project and has to be brought in as additional scope. For change that's within the contract, the customer has a tendency sometimes to try to over control on that. And they need to, again, this is a matter of socialization. The socialization part of the integrated baseline review is developing trust with the people that you're working with, so that it's known that something needs to be done and how that's going to be incorporated. That's not a very definite answer, I'm afraid.
Okay, and I think this was the last question we have on our attendance.
I can,
Anyone else? What?
people have my email address. They're welcome to address questions to me that they don't want to share elsewhere, that I
Okay.
will answer to the extent that I can.
Oh, good. Thank you. You're very kind. And I think so. We're coming to an end. And thank you for the audience for being the peak of our audience, almost 50 people at the same time, Mr. Watt. So our record. Thank you for
Excellent.
helping us to break this record. And we are pleased with the audience. We are also having some comments on LinkedIn at this moment. And in the name of our section, Aace Brazilian section, we'd like to thank you very much for this wonderful speech. The material, your stories, the case have gone through a huge source of wisdom. And we thank you very much for having you with us here. Now,
Thank you.
Sandro, any words, Sandro?
Yeah, it was very enlightful, this presentation by Mr. Wayne Abba. Very, very interesting stories of his time in the government and now as a consultant. And we thank you very much for taking the time and being here with us, even with the delay by Brazilians to start the webinars. And thank you very much again. And thanks to everyone who was here with us and followed us and presented questions, excellent questions. It was a very, very interesting session, definitely.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And you, Inaiara?
Quero agradecer também. Você traduz aí, vou falar devagar.
Ah, tá.
Eu queria agradecer muito pelo excelente conteúdo, pelo brainstorming, por todos os questionamentos, pela disponibilidade dele de ficar além da live, né, ainda responder todas as perguntas. E espero que seja o primeiro de muitas participações dele no Brasil, na Aace Seção Brasil.
She's providing you, giving you her thanks for being with us, and also for being so gentle in providing so depth answers to our questions, to the questions they presented. And she really expects that is only the first time with us, and she hopes that we can be together in the near future.
Indeed. Thank you.
Okay.
E ficamos honrados de ter uma autoridade como ele, né, palestrando para a gente aqui.
Okay, and soon follow us on LinkedIn, because soon will be published the recording uploading on YouTube, so you can review it again and can also share this with your colleagues that were not able to be here with us today. Okay, so Mr. Wayne Abba, thank you again so much, and have a good evening.
Thank you. The same to you, and I will